welcome from San Diego. We are at the 83rd American Diabetes Association sessions here in San Diego, and I'm Akshay Jain, an endocrinologist from Surrey, British Columbia. And with me is Professor Perkins from the University of Toronto. We've had some very good information shared at the ADA. 40 years ago is when DCCT came out, which showed us that intensive control of glucose in type 1 diabetes leads to really good outcomes. So we see reduction in microvascular complications by almost 40%. And followed up was the data from EDIC. It's been 40 years since then. So Professor Perkins, what have you learned in these 40 years?
Yeah, so it turns out a lot. It was nice to have this 40th anniversary symposium because we got a chance to celebrate participants who've committed in their life participation in a trial and an observational follow-up for 40 years, a big deal, and also our huge network across North America of investigators and coordinators. So listen, it's not news that intensive treatment, which involved simple things like more than 2 injections a day or an insulin pump, had huge impact. In fact, it was like 70% reductions in like a primary outcome like retinopathy, depending on primary and secondary prevention. So huge impact. But now we can kind of look back, like what did it actually influence in care? Is it just a, kind of itemizing that intensive treatment's important, or did it really change the way we manage diabetes? And actually it's changed fundamentally how we think about coaching people around type 1 diabetes and patients themselves self-managing. So imagine that even going to 3 or more injections, that'll open the possibility to basal insulin versus bolus and more stable basal insulins that allow lower insulin between meals, so people are less likely to have hypoglycemia, less likely to gain weight, and then rapid acting analogs that have faster offset, so it also reduces hypo and weight gain between meals, automation of insulin. So it's not like DCCT tested those innovations, but it opened the floodgates for their development. We called it the domino effect. But there's a whole bunch of other implications. It set the standards for screening frequency. It is our main source that helps us understand the glucose hypothesis and cardiovascular disease. This concept of metabolic memory that's forced us to even more so in adolescents and young adults who have, on average, really struggle with glycemic control, to help those groups more so, but also to offer hope for someone who's had higher glycemic exposure for some years, that it's never too late to improve it. And then we really wanted to highlight the impact that DCCT had on future trials. It also opened the floodgates for NIDDK sponsored research, large projects in prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and all the ancillary studies and collaborations. But I just finished by saying that it's these 5 years of funding that we're in now and these next years where we have amazing objectives, understanding things associated with aging, cognitive function, this interaction between essentially weight gain and insulin resistance in type 1 diabetes, things like fatty liver disease, sleep apnea. We're doing some amazing techniques and examinations, including cardiopulmonary testing, for example. So it is actually really exciting. When I joined DCCTEDIC over these last 5 or 10 years, I was always afraid that this is going to be the last 5 years of funding, but I honestly feel very encouraged that this is going to still be a very long-term observational follow-up of a trial.
And it has given us so much more information, right? Funding is one important aspect of a long-term trial.
Right.
But the really impressive part in this EDIC 40-year data is that you had 90% patients who were, recruited are still retained. And that must be very gratifying to see these patients are still wanting to continue to obviously share their information and participate in our understanding of diabetes.
I think in part, it's that even though the word wasn't coined decades ago when DCCT was being designed and implemented, it's patient-engaged research. There's very close communication with coordinators and PIs with patients. Patients are determining research objectives, how protocols are being set out, do they make sense, and are very engaged in the results. I love it because I'm very much dedicated to patient-oriented research. And honestly, I think DCCT is a perfect example, even though it was not officially named as patient-oriented research in the day.
Great. And if you had to look into a crystal ball and see in the next few years, for clinicians out in the trenches, what are the things they can look forward to from further learnings from the DCCT edict?
Yeah, actually, I'll focus on this. I'm kind of afraid about all the data in the general population in type 2 diabetes about the impact of fatty liver disease and steatosis and fibrosis. Apparently, we're going to be running into a pandemic of liver disease. And we're going to be studying this, and we've started, and we're already seeing that there's this phenotype of fatty liver disease, even in type 1, that we didn't think would be there. So we're going to solve that problem. We're going to understand it much better, how big of an issue is that in type 1. And I think that might open the door to considering drugs for fatty liver, which are essentially type 2 diabetes drugs in people with type 1 diabetes.
40 years now, the average age of the person enrolled in EDIC is now 63. So as you're looking at, of course, the diabetes aspect, we also have to factor in the physiology of aging. So what are the key points that you'll be looking at for this population now that's much older compared to when they entered EDIC?
Yeah, so a big part of it is cognition, brain, what type 1 diabetes specific therapies or complications may push issues with brain and cognition. And so we're starting to understand things like that we don't see the Alzheimer's disease-like patterns in the brain, more so this phenotype of brain aging, but we're going to be doing repeat imaging and further cognitive testing